The forest did not care that Elara Moonveil was breaking. The ground was cold beneath her bare feet, wet with night dew, and scattered thorns that bit into her skin with every step. Dawn crept slowly across the sky behind her, pale and unforgiving, revealing the truth she could no longer run from. She was alone. Behind her lay night-found territory, the pack. The alpha who had looked at her and chosen power over love. Ahead of her lay exile, hunger, and a future she had never planned for. Elara staggered, one hand gripping a tree trunk as nausea surged again. This time, she didn't curse her weakness. This time, her other hand moved instinctively, protectively to her stomach. "I know," she whispered hoarsely into the empty forest. "I know." The bond tugged at her chest like an open wound. Kael's presence distant now, furious and fractured, pounded faintly through it. He knew something was wrong, he just didn't know what. Good. Let him feel the absence. Let him feel the hollow she'd carried alone. Elara straightened, jaw trembling, tears finally spilling as the reality settled deep into her bones. "They will never touch you," she vowed softly. Not his pride, not his crown, not his mistakes. Above her, the moon faded, but something else lingered. A pulse, warm, powerful, alive. And for the first time since the night she was rejected, Elara did not feel fragile. She felt dangerous. The old healer's words did not echo. They detonated. She left carrying your heir. Alpha Kael did not move. The world did not breathe. The bramblewood itself seemed to recoil from the truth now hanging, toxic and immortal, in the air between them. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, Kael's mind was a white, silent void. Then it was flooded with a tsunami of images. Elara's pale face in the grove, her hand fluttering near her waist. The unsteadiness he'd called fragility. The nausea she'd blamed on nerves. The way she'd looked at him in the great hall, not with heartbreak, but with a secret, devastating knowledge. He had not just broken her heart, he had exiled his own blood. A sound tore from him, not a roar, but a raw, guttural scrape of agony. His control, the very foundation of his alpha power, shattered. His grey wolf surged to the surface in a violent, uncontrolled ripple of muscle and bone. A half-shift that twisted his form, claws erupting from his fingers, his face contorting between man and beast. Where is she? The demand was a snarl, layered with human desperation and wolfen fury, raw enough to make the ancient healer take a step back, though her flinty eyes remained unyielding. But the healer was already fading into the thicket, her form becoming one with the shadow and thorn. Her final words drifted back, not as a taunt, but as a verdict, where you will never think to look. She chose the silence you gave her. Then she was gone. Kael's half-shifted form shuddered. The urge to give full chase, to raze the bramblewood to the ground until it gave up its secret, was a fire in his veins. But a colder, more terrible logic froze him. If he moved now with this fury, the entire pack would know. The elders would know. Lyra and her father would know. The secret of his heir, vulnerable, unprotected, outside his territory, would become the greatest weakness his enemies could ever imagine. He was trapped by his own choice, by his own lie. With a shudder that racked his whole body, he forced the wolf back, slamming it behind the walls of his control. The claws retracted, leaving his human hands bleeding. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was the pressurized silence before an avalanche. He turned and ran, not after the healer, not after Elara. He ran back toward his stronghold, every stride a rebellion against his own soul. He had to think, he had to plan, he had to find her without anyone knowing. Elara felt it the moment he knew. She was 3 miles beyond the Nightfang border, in the skeletal, grey woods of the unclaimed lands, when the frayed, near-dead thread of their bond suddenly went taut and white-hot. It was not a pull of love, but a blast wave of pure, undiluted shock, followed by a searing spike of anguish so profound it stole her breath. She stumbled, catching herself against a frost-slick boulder. The jolt cut through the numb determination that had been propelling her forward. Her hand flew to her stomach. He knows. The healer had told him, or he had guessed. The truth was out. For a second, sheer primal terror paralyzed her. She saw him in her mind's eye, not the cold alpha from the great hall, but Kael the hunter, Kael the relentless. He would come. He would tear the world apart to reclaim what was his, her fragile plan of disappearing into obscurity, evaporated like mist. A cramp, sharp and low in her belly, made her gasp. It was the child, reacting to the storm of emotion or her own spike of fear. The pain was a bucket of ice water on her panic. No, he might know. But he did not have her. He had given up that right. He had severed the bond before he ever knew it was a triad. This was not his child to claim. It was hers to protect. The terror crystallized, hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve. She pushed off the boulder and began to move again, not with the steady trudge of an exile, but with the focused, desperate energy of prey who knows the predator is now awake. Her weakness and nausea were still there. A constant, grinding misery. But she used them, let them sharpen her senses. Every rustle in the barren bracken was a scout. Every distant bird call was a signal. The landscape grew steeper, rockier. The comforting, deep-loamed forests of her home were gone, replaced by jagged granite and whispering, bare-limbed trees. The unknown wasn't waiting ahead anymore. It was swallowing her whole, and it was terrifying. But beneath the fear, something else flickered. With every step that took her farther from his reach, every breath of air that didn't smell of Nightfang pines and pack smoke, a new space opened inside her. It was a space not defined by what she had lost, but by what she carried. The bond ached behind her, a phantom limb screaming, but ahead, beneath her palm pressed to the growing firmness of her womb, was a tiny independent pulse of life. His blood, her child. She climbed a treacherous scree slope, her feet slipping on the loose stones, her worn dress catching on thorns. At the top, as a bruised dawn finally began to bleed light into the grey sky, she looked back. She could see nothing of the territory. It was hidden behind ridges and mist. It was gone. She turned her face into the rising wind. It was bitter, and it carried the scent of snow and wild, lonely places. This was not escape. Escape implied freedom, and she was not free. She was hunted. She was starving. She was carrying a legacy that could get her killed. This was survival, raw, brutal, and simple. And for the first time, staring into the vast, uncaring wilderness, Elara understood the true shape of her new life. She was no one's Luna, no one's mate. She was a vessel, a fortress, and a road all leading away from him. She whispered it to the dawn, to the child, to the new, hardened core of herself. We survive. And she walked on, leaving the last echo of the bond and the man who shattered it to die in the cold air behind her. The dawn that witnessed her vow bled into a grey, endless day, then another. Time lost its meaning in the unclaimed lands. It was measured not by the sun's arc, but by the growing, hollow ache in her stomach and the slow, inexorable deepening of the chill in her bones. Survival was a brutal teacher. The initial surge of adrenaline that had propelled her beyond the border was gone, replaced by a grinding, exhausting reality. Food was not simply scarce. It was a puzzle her body was ill-equipped to solve. Her senses, while sharpened by fear, were tuned to the gentle herbs and prepared meats of pack life, not the hidden, wintry bounty of the wilderness. She found a patch of shriveled, frost-bitten berries. They were tart and woody, and they churned in her stomach, bringing her to her knees with cramps. A few days later, she managed to trap a thin, slow-moving hare in a snare made of braided vine. The sight of its lifeless body, the act of skinning it with a sharp stone, made her vomit until she was empty. She forced herself to eat the stringy, cooked meat, chewing each bite until it was tasteless paste, swallowing only for the life inside her. Sleep was not rest. It was a calculated risk. Her first night, she'd collapsed in exhaustion beneath a fallen log. She'd awoken to the hot, meaty breath of a wild boar sniffing at her legs. She'd frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, until it had grunted and lumbered away. Now she slept in fits and starts, curled in the highest crook of a tree she could manage, or wedged into narrow, rocky crevices. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, jolted her awake, hand flying to the makeshift knife she'd fashioned. The darkness was no longer peaceful. It was a canvas for every predator's approach. The silence was the most profound change. It wasn't just an absence of pack sounds, the laughter, the howls, the clang of the forge. It was an absence of connection. There was no mind link humming with distant thoughts, no low-grade awareness of Kael's presence at the edge of her consciousness. The bond was a dead nerve, a silent, scarred-over wound. The loneliness was a physical weight, heavier than her satchel, colder than the ground. She was alone, truly, utterly alone, and she was responsible for a life that was slowly, secretly, beginning to reshape her from the inside out. One afternoon, caught in a sudden, sleeting rain, she took shelter under a rocky overhang. Shivering, she built a meagre, smoking fire from damp twigs. As she huddled close, trying to coax warmth into her stiff fingers, she felt it a faint, fluttering pressure, low in her belly. Not a cramp, not nausea, a quickening. It was soft as a moth's wing, a tiny internal brush against her awareness. It lasted only a second, but it stole her breath. All the hunger, the fear, the crushing loneliness receded. In that silent, dripping cavern, with the sleet hissing outside, a connection sparked that had nothing to do with broken mate bonds or pack loyalty. She was not alone. Tears, the first she'd allowed herself since the grove, welled hot and sudden, cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. They were not tears of self-pity, but of awe, and a fierce, possessive love that burned away the last of her fragility. She placed both hands over the spot. "Hello," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "I'm here." The moment was shattered by a sound from the woods beyond the overhang, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the wet earth. It was close. A wolf, but not a pack wolf, a rogue, or something worse. Instantly, her fire was forgotten. Every muscle coiled. Her own wolf, suppressed and weakened by hunger and pregnancy, stirred uneasily. Her hand closed around her stone knife. This was the lesson etched into her bones now. There was no alpha to protect her, no patrols to scare off intruders, no territory to claim. There was only her wits, and the life she had to shield. The growl came again, closer. A shadow moved at the edge of the tree line. Yellow eyes gleamed in the gloom. Elara bared her teeth, a silent snarl forming on her lips. She did not rise to fight. She shifted her body, putting the rock wall at her back, and angled herself between the threat and the place where her child had just greeted her. She was not the alpha's fragile mate anymore. She was not just a survivor. She was a mother, and a mother defending her den was the most dangerous creature in any woods. The standoff stretched, the sleet hissing between them. Finally, with a disgruntled snort, the shadow retreated, melting back into the grey forest. Elara didn't relax. She stayed poised, listening, until the only sound was the rain. Then, slowly, she sank down, her energy spent. But her hand remained on her stomach, a promise, a ward. The hunger would return, the cold would seep in, the silence would press down. But now, the silence had a heartbeat, and she would learn to live by its rhythm. The sleet turned to a true storm, a howling, wind-whipped tempest that tore through the skeletal woods like an angry god. There was no shelter deep enough, no overhang broad enough. The rocky crevice that had hidden her from the rogue wolf became a channel for icy water, pooling around her shins, sapping the last warmth from her core. For 2 days, she pushed through the drowning world. Her feet were numb blocks, her soaked dress a heavy, freezing shroud. The meagre hair meat was gone. The fluttering, quickening she'd felt was now a constant, low ache of hunger, not just hers, but a silent, demanding pull from within. The child was growing, and it needed nourishment she could not provide. On the 3rd morning of the storm, as she tried to ford a swollen, furious stream, her body finally betrayed her. A wave of dizziness, black at the edges, washed over her. The world tilted. The roar of the water and the scream of the wind merged into a single, deafening white noise. Her foot slipped on a submerged, moss-slick stone. There was no grace in the fall. She crashed into the icy torrent. The breath knocked from her lungs. The current snatched her, tumbling her like a broken branch. Her head struck a rock. A flash of blinding pain. Then nothing but cold, dark silence. Consciousness returned in fragments. First, the cold, a deep, marrow-deep ache that felt permanent. Then, the sound of the storm, now distant, rumbling like a passing beast. Finally, a sharp, rhythmic pain in her side where she'd been battered against the river rocks. Elara opened her eyes to a world of grey twilight. She was half beached on a gravel bar, the stream still clawing at her legs. How long had she been there? An hour? A night? Every part of her screamed to stay down, to let the cold finish what the river had started. The exhaustion was a weight greater than stone. It would be so easy. The pain would stop. The hunger would cease. The relentless, terrifying responsibility would be over. A deeper, more primal spasm clenched in her abdomen, a protest, a fear that was not her own. In that moment, something bypassed her broken will and took direct command of her limbs. Her right arm, bruised and bloody, moved. Not to push herself up, not to brush the hair from her face. It dragged itself across her body, her fingers splaying wide and pressed flat, possessive and shielding over the curve of her lower stomach. It was an instinct older than packs, older than alphas, older than language. The gesture shot a bolt of clarity through the fog of surrender. She looked down at her own muddy, trembling hand pressed against the life beneath. The fear, that had been her constant companion, fear of Kael, fear of starvation, fear of the wild, did not vanish. It transformed, it sharpened, it heated, it became a blade of pure feral resolve. This was not about her suffering anymore. Her hunger was a problem to be solved. Her cold was a condition to be overcome. Her pain was data, informing her of injuries to be compensated for. Every resource of her mind, every scrap of strength in her body, was now funneled toward a single, non-negotiable purpose. She rolled onto her side, groaning as her ribs protested. With a grit that ground against her own despair, she pushed up onto her hands and knees. Water streamed from her hair. She coughed, a ragged, wet sound. "Okay?" She rasped to the howling wind, to the relentless stream, to the tiny life under her palm. "Okay." She forced herself to stand, legs trembling violently. The world swayed, but the new resolve was an anchor. She took inventory: a likely bruised rib, a gash on her temple, hypothermia, starvation, problems, not death sentences. She stumbled away from the stream, her eyes scanning the blurred landscape, not for escape, but for resources, shelter, fire, food, in that order. She found a deadfall, a massive pine that had collapsed against a granite shelf, creating a dry, enclosed pocket. It stank of rot and animal musk, but it was out of the wind. With numb fingers, she gathered the driest tinder she could find from inside the log. Her first attempts to spark a fire with her flint failed, her hands shaking too badly. She closed her eyes, took a breath that centered not on her own panic, but on the steady, silent presence she was protecting. On the fifth try, a spark caught. A tiny, defiant flame bloomed in the moss. She nursed it with her breath, with slivers of bark, until it grew into a small, steady blaze. The heat was a miracle on her skin. As the firelight flickered against the rotten wood, she looked at her hand again, now clean of mud from the stream, still resting on her stomach. The words came then, not a whisper, but a low, unwavering vow into the crackling silence. It was a contract signed with her blood, her pain, and her last shred of hope. "I will endure anything." Her voice was hoarse but iron strong. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the fear. "I will drink bitterness and walk through fire. I will become a ghost, a monster, a story told to scare pups. I will bear every wound, weather every storm." She leaned closer to the flames, her shadow a giant, protective shape on the wood behind her. Her eyes glowed with the reflection of the fire, and something fiercer. "But you," she promised, the vow settling into her bones, becoming part of her very blueprint. "You will live." It was no longer a hope. It was law, the first law of her new world. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the deadfall, for the first time since she left the sentinel oak, Elara was not just surviving, she was ruling. The fire in the deadfall became her hearth, her temple. The resolve forged in the river was the steel in her spine. She moved with a new, grim efficiency. The bruised rib was wrapped with strips torn from her dress. The gash on her temple scabbed over. She learned to set better snares, to find edible roots beneath the frost-hardened earth, to distinguish between a healing moss and a poisonous lichen. She was gaunt, her eyes shadowed, but they held a light that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with purpose. And then the world around her began to shift in ways she could not explain. It started with the animals. A family of foxes, whose den she'd camped near for 2 nights, abruptly abandoned it at dawn, slipping away without a sound, their kits carried gently in their jaws. She found a nest of freshly laid eggs in a hollow, a rare treasure. But when she approached, the mother grouse didn't shriek or feign injury. She simply froze, her black eye fixed on Elara with a profound, instinctive terror, then bolted, leaving the eggs behind. They were cold when Elara took them. A pack of timber wolves crossed her path one evening, their grey forms flowing through the trees like smoke. They were well fed, their coats thick, prime hunters. Elara had shrunk back, heart hammering, knife ready. The lead wolf, a massive male with a scar across his muzzle, stopped. He turned his great head and looked directly at her. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He sniffed the air once, twice. Then he let out a low, almost puzzled whine, and deliberately led his pack in a wide, silent arc around her, giving her a berth of 50 paces before disappearing into the gloom. They hadn't seen her as prey. They hadn't seen her as a threat. They had seen her as other. Then she noticed her own scent. The healer's oil still masked the alpha signature, but beneath the mint and stone, her natural fragrance was changing. It was deeper, richer, carrying a faint ozone tang like the air after a lightning strike, and something else, a smell of deep old earth and new green growth, a paradox that shouldn't exist in the dead of winter. When the wind shifted, she caught whiffs of it herself, and it was alien. It was powerful. The moon confirmed it. A clear night came, the first since the storm. Exhausted, she lay on her back at the mouth of her latest shelter, a shallow cave watching the silver disk climb. The light fell on her, cold and clean. But when she finally stirred to go inside, she saw it. A faint, luminescent shimmer clung to her skin, particularly over her stomach, lingering like powdered silver long after the direct light had passed. She rubbed her arm, but the gentle glow didn't smudge. It faded slowly, on its own, as if absorbed. One night, driven by a strange pull, she stood in a moonlit clearing. As the light bathed her, a warmth kindled in her womb, a gentle, answering pulse. And for a fleeting, impossible second, the shadows around her stilled. The rustling leaves fell silent. The wind held its breath. It was as if the very forest paused, listening to a heartbeat not yet born. Elara hugged herself, the awe now tinged with a spike of fear. This was more than alpha blood. Kael was strong, his will formidable, his aura commanding. But this was different. This was elemental. The child was not ordinary. The realization settled over her not as a shock, but as a deep, humming truth. It explained the animal's reverence fear. It explained the change in her. It explained the moon's affection. A son? A daughter? It didn't matter. This was a child touched by something primal, a power that whispered of the oldest magics, the kind spoken of in pack legends before they were wolves, when the world was wilder and the lines between beast, man, and spirit were blurred. A fierce, possessive pride swelled in her chest, followed immediately by a protective dread so vast it stole her breath. If Kael's hunters found her now, they wouldn't just be bringing back a political heir. They would be capturing a living secret, a power to be controlled, studied, or worse, feared and destroyed. And Kael? What would the dutiful, fearful alpha do with a child who bent moonlight and silenced forests? She placed both hands over her womb, where the strange, warm pulse was slowly fading. "Your father wanted a strong heir," she whispered into the silent, attentive night. "But you, my little one, you are not just strong, you are wild. You are a secret the world has forgotten how to keep." She looked up at the moon, no longer just a symbol of pack ritual, but a silent accomplice. "And I will teach it to remember." The wildness growing within her was a compass, but it didn't point towards safety. It pulled her deeper into the raw, untamed heart of the unclaimed lands. The forests grew denser, the mountains steeper. She was a ghost, moving through a world that seemed to hold its breath around her. The strange ozone earth scent that now clung to her kept the beasts at bay, but it did nothing to fill her belly or mend the tear in her dress from the river's wrath. The first snow fell, a silent, deadly blanket. It was then, as she stood shivering on a wind-swept ridge, that she saw it. A thin, grey spire of smoke curling from a hidden valley below. Not the straight, confident column of a pack's central fire, but the hazy, persistent signal of a scattered, stubborn life. Instinct screamed danger. Civilization, even a crude one, meant eyes, questions. The risk of recognition, but a deeper, more urgent instinct, the one that felt the child's hunger as her own, the one that remembered the relentless bite of the coming winter, overruled her fear, shelter, sustenance. A single night by a shared fire. She approached as a shadow at dusk, moving with the silence the wilderness had taught her. The settlement was less a village and more a scar on the landscape. A dozen rough-hewn huts leaned against each other for support, built from salvaged timber and patched with hides. A single smoky fire pit glowed in the centre. Figures moved slowly in the fading light, a woman with a haunted face mending a net, an old man with one arm chopping wood, a young couple speaking in low tones, their eyes never settling. These were not pack wolves. Their scents were a muddled tapestry of different lineages, or of no lineage at all. Rogues, exiles, wolves who had failed their challenges, broken their laws, or simply walked away. The unwanted, the unforgiven. Elara hesitated at the tree line. The healer's oil and her own changed scent a veil over her identity. She took a breath, buried the last shred of her pride, the pride of a Luna, and stepped into the circle of firelight. All movement stopped. A dozen pairs of eyes lifted to her. They were not welcoming, but they were not hostile either. It was a flat, weary assessment. They saw a young woman, painfully thin, her dress torn and stained, her face sharp with hunger and smudged with travel grime. They saw the subtle, protective curve of her hand over her middle, a universal language in any world. No one gasped. No one whispered Luna. No one saw the mate of an alpha. They saw only what she was now, a woman trying to survive. An older she-wolf with a scar across her throat and eyes the colour of tarnished silver broke the silence. Lost? Cold, Elara replied, her voice raspy. It wasn't a lie. The scarred woman Mara, as Elara would learn, nodded toward the fire. Warm yourself. The cold takes the weak first. It was not kindness. It was a simple statement of survival logic. Elara moved to the fire, the heat a blissful agony on her frozen skin. She sat, keeping her gaze down, her posture non-threatening. A wooden bowl was pushed toward her, filled with a thin, greasy stew of unidentified meat and roots. It was the most glorious thing she had ever smelled. As she ate, slowly, fighting the urge to devour it, she listened. They spoke of trapping lines, of a poisoned stream to the east, of the worsening weather. There was no talk of alphas or pack politics. Their world was bounded by the next meal, the next storm, the need to remain unseen. For the first time since her exile, the crushing weight of her past, of Kael, of the rejection, of the glittering cage she'd escaped, felt distant, irrelevant. Here, her greatest shame was irrelevant, because it was unimagined. A man with a limp offered her a worn fur to sleep on. A young mother with a silent toddler gave her a strip of dried venison for the morning. No names were asked, no stories were exchanged. In their silence, she found a profound acceptance. That night, curled on the hard ground near the communal fire, the strange moon glow softly shimmering on her skin, hidden beneath the fur, Elara felt something she thought she'd lost forever. A sliver of peace. She was not safe, not truly. But she was, for this moment, unseen. Not as Elara, the rejected Luna of the Nightfang pack, but simply as a woman, a mother-to-be. Another exile tending her own fragile flame against the vast, uncaring dark. It was the most honest identity she'd ever worn, while Elara found a fleeting, anonymous peace in the exile's firelight. A storm of a different kind raged in the heart of the Nightfang stronghold. Alpha Kael stood on the high northern battlement, the same place he had stood the morning after the rejection. But the man who looked out over his territory now was a fractured ruin of the one who had stood there before. The knowledge the Bramblewood healer had imparted was not a fact he possessed, it was a disease he hosted. It poisoned his blood, his thoughts, his every breath. Your heir. The words were a taunt, a condemnation, a ghostly cry in the wind that never ceased. He had sent out his most trusted scoutsmen, who owed their loyalty to him, not the council on a silent, desperate mission. Find a trace, any trace, of a pregnant she-wolf in the eastern wilds. They returned with nothing. It was as if the unclaimed lands themselves had swallowed her. Each empty report was a hammer blow on the already splintering foundation of his control. In the great hall, where he was meant to project unshakable strength for the Mountain Ridge Alliance talks, his focus shattered like cheap glass. Elder Thorn would be detailing border patrol schedules, and Kael would see Elara's hand fluttering to her stomach in the grove. Beta Garon would ask for a ruling on a disputed hunting ground, and Kael would hear the old healer's rasp. She left carrying your heir. His commands became erratic. He ordered a patrol to the desolate, frozen south for no reason, leaving the more vulnerable eastern border thin. He snapped at a young warrior during a training exercise, his critique unnecessarily brutal. The pack, already uneasy, began to murmur. Their alpha's famed icy control was melting, revealing something volatile and desperate beneath. Lyra watched it all. She sat beside him at the high table, the picture of poised alliance, her frost blue gown a constant reminder of the pact. At first, she had mistaken his distraction for the heavy weight of kingship. Then, she thought it was lingering sentiment for the cast-off mate, a weakness to be gently, firmly supplanted. But as the days bled into a moon cycle, she saw the truth. This wasn't grief, it was obsession. His eyes, when they weren't glazed with distance, held a hunted, frantic light. He would stare at the eastern windows as if he could see through stone and forest. He would flinch at sudden sounds, not like a warrior, but like a man expecting a ghost. One evening, after a particularly tense council where Kael had nearly agreed to cede a valuable mineral-rich gulch to her father before abruptly reversing himself, Lyra followed him to his private chambers. He stood, as usual, at the window, his back to her. "The alliance requires a clear mind, Kael," she said, her voice smooth, but the edge of a blade glinted beneath. "Your pack needs a steady hand. This distraction serves no one." He didn't turn. "My pack is my concern." "Is it?" she challenged, stepping closer. "Or is your concern wandering somewhere in the bramblewood, wearing the face of a liability?" He whirled on her then, a snarl curling his lip. "Do not speak of what you do not know." It was the heat in his voice, the raw, defensive fury, that confirmed her suspicion. This was not about a rejected woman. This was about something he had lost, something he needed. Lyra's blue eyes cooled from calculation to glacial understanding. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a powerful alpha choosing a strategic partner, but a trapped, desperate man drowning in a mistake of his own making. The hollows under his eyes, the tremor in his clenched fists, the way his gaze kept escaping to the east, it all painted a damning picture. She was not his choice. She was his consolation prize, his political panacea, and the woman he truly wanted, needed, was gone, carrying the one thing that could truly shatter Lyra's future, his legitimate heir. A slow, cold smile touched her lips, devoid of any warmth. "I see," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like frost forming on glass. "You didn't choose strength over love, Alpha. You made a catastrophic error, and now you are trying to hunt down your own mistake before the world finds out." Kael said nothing. His silence was a confession. Lyra took a step back, her mind already racing, reassessing every clause of the treaty, every promise of loyalty. She was not married to him yet. The formal mating ceremony was still a moon away. "My father," she said, her tone now purely, dangerously diplomatic, "values stability above all else. He will be concerned to hear of your current state. I will assure him it is merely fatigue." It was a threat, exquisitely wrapped. "Get your house in order, or the alliance and the strength you bought by rejecting her crumbles." She left him there, his world cracking apart under the weight of his secret. Lyra walked to her guest suite, not with the hurt of a rejected mate, but with the cold fury of a strategist whose chess piece had just revealed itself to be broken. She had come for a throne. Now, she realized she might be standing on a battlefield, and the war had already begun in the Alpha's own shattered soul. The exile settlement offered no permanence, only a pause. Elara stayed long enough to regain a sliver of strength, to mend her dress with sinew thread, to trade her labour, foraging the most tender winter greens from places. Only her strange new scent seemed to guide her for a warmer, patched rabbit fur cloak. She left before the first curious question could be asked, her path now curving northward, following an instinct that felt less like her own and more like a gentle, internal pull. The child was growing. Her body was changing. The curve of her belly now a firm, undeniable swell beneath the layers of fur and wool. The quickening had become a regular, comforting rhythm of movement, soft rolls and nudges that spoke of life, not legend. Then came the night of the silent frost. She had found a sheltered alcove high in the foothills, a natural stone bowl facing south. A bitter, windless cold had settled, so intense it seemed to crystallize the very air. She had a small, contained fire, but its heat was a feeble protest against the deep cold. She huddled over it, her breath pluming, trying to warm her fingers enough to grip her knife and sharpen a stick. A deep, bone-aching weariness settled on her. It was more than physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of constant vigilance, of endless solitude, of a heart that had been broken and reforged into a tool for survival. For a fleeting, treacherous moment, a whisper of the old despair returned. How can I do this alone? How can I bring a child into this frozen, merciless dark? As if in response to her doubt, she felt it. It was not a kick. It was a deep, resonant pulse, originating from the very core of her being. It wasn't physical. It was a wave of pure, quiet power that radiated outwards, vibrating through her bones, her blood, the marrow of her soul. In its wake, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, the small fire before her roared, not with new fuel, but with sudden, fierce intensity, the flames leaping double their height, burning a blinding, clean white at their heart, casting stark, dancing shadows on the stone. The heat that blasted out was a summer sun, pushing back the killing cold in an instant. Second, the pervasive, gnawing ache of hunger in her own stomach vanished, not sated, but silenced, overridden by a profound, steadying fullness, as if she had just consumed a feast. Third, and most profoundly, her own wolf, the part of her spirit that was beast, that had been cowed and suppressed through rejection and exile, did something it had never done before. It bowed, internally. In the landscape of her spirit, her grey she-wolf lowered her head, tucking her tail, not in fear, but in instinctive, undeniable submission. It was a recognition of a hierarchy written in blood and soul, a response to a dominance so innate, so absolute, it demanded reverence from the moment it stirred. Elara sat frozen, her hands suspended over the now blazing fire. The pulse faded, leaving behind the crackle of superheated wood and a ringing silence in her spirit. The warmth lingered, the fullness remained. Slowly, she brought her trembling hands to her swollen belly. The power hadn't been external. It hadn't been the moon or the forest. It had come from within, from the child. This was not just alpha dominance. Kael's dominance was a force of will, a command of flesh and fear, a storm to be weathered. This was something purer, an ancient, unasked-for sovereignty. The child did not command the fire, its mere wakefulness strengthened it. It did not command her wolf, its innate presence humbled it. It was power not as a weapon, but as a birthright, as natural as breath. Ah, vast and terrifying, flooded her. Her earlier despair seemed laughable now, a tiny thing before the colossal reality she carried. "He doesn't just carry your blood, Kael," she whispered into the silent, now warm night, her voice filled with a dawning reverence. "He carries the throne you were too afraid to share." She felt another, softer nudge than a physical one, a gentle press against her palm, a reassurance, a connection. Elara did not sleep that night. She sat vigil by the miraculously sustained fire, one hand resting on the source of the warmth, feeling the quiet, immense potential slumbering within. She was no longer just a mother protecting a child. She was the guardian of a king. And her exile was not a punishment. It was the first step of a reluctant queen, securing the heir to a kingdom that did not yet know it was waiting for him. The fire's supernatural warmth lasted until dawn, a lingering testament to the power that had stirred within her. In the cold light of day, the reality of it was even more terrifying. This was no longer a secret she could hide with healer's oils and a stoic face. The child's power was a beacon, pulsing in a frequency she feared the world might still remember how to hear. She moved with a new, urgent caution, heading higher into the rocky, snow-dusted crags, seeking not just shelter, but obscurity. The child's silent, strengthening presence seemed to guide her steps, steering her away from thin ice and unstable slopes with an intuition that felt like her own, only wiser. For 3 days, the only sounds were the wind's mournful song and the steady rhythm of her own heart. She began to believe, in a fragile, hopeful corner of her soul, that perhaps they could vanish completely, that the wilderness itself would enfold and conceal them. On the 4th day, she was hunting a snow hare, her movements slow and deliberate, when a new scent hit the air. Not animal, wolf. It was pungent, laced with a sharp tang of iron and pine resin, a hunter's scent, a pack hunter. It was faint, carried on a downwind draft, but it was unmistakable. Not Nightfang. This was earthier, wilder. A scout from one of the scattered minor packs that clung to the edges of the great territories, perhaps the grey rock or the stone howl. Her body locked, every instinct screaming to become stone. She pressed herself into the lee of a boulder, her grey fur cloak blending with the granite. Through a crack in the rock, she saw him, a muscular, tawny-furred wolf in his beast form, padding silently along a game trail 50 yards below her alcove. He paused, his head lifting, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. He was searching for something. Not her, not specifically, but for game, for trespassers, for anything of value. The wind shifted, coiling lazily up the slope toward him, and Elara felt it. A sleepy, contented pulse from her womb, a warm little sigh of power, a gentle ripple of the dominion that had humbled her own wolf and commanded the fire. It was the child, stretching in its sleep, unaware. The hunter's head snapped up. He went perfectly still, his ears swiveled forward, not toward the hare's trail, but up toward her. He couldn't see her. He couldn't smell her familiar scent through the oil and her own changed aura. But he had sensed something, a vibration in the world's fabric, a whisper of ancient hierarchy that made the wolf in him sit up and take notice. His body language shifted from hunter to something more cautious, more curious. He took a tentative step up the slope. Ice flooded Elara's veins. It wasn't Kael, but it was proof of her worst fear. If an ordinary pack hunter, downwind and distracted, could prick his ears at the child's dormant power, what would a trained Nightfang tracker sent by a desperate alpha feel? What would an elder steeped in old lore recognize? What would a rival alpha do if he caught the scent of an unborn heir with power that resonated like a distant, waking drum? The hunter took another step, a low, inquisitive whine in his throat. Elara didn't wait. She didn't fight. She melted backwards, a shadow detaching from a shadow, moving with the desperate silence of pure terror. She left the hare, left the trail, left any semblance of a plan. The truth was a knife in her gut. She could not just hide. The child within her was becoming, with every passing day, inherently unhideable. Its power was a signature she could not mask. Kael might be searching for a pregnant she-wolf, but soon every supernatural creature in these mountains might be drawn to the signal of a sleeping monarch. She climbed until her lungs burned, pushing beyond the tree line into a realm of scree and sheer rock faces and eternal wind. The cold was a brutal physical enemy here, but it was a cleaner danger. Few hunters came this high, few things lived here at all. As night fell, she crammed herself into a shallow fissure in the rock, shivering violently, the child's warmth a small, defiant furnace at her core. She stared out at the vast, black expanse below, dotted with the distant, hostile pinpricks of other packs' territory fires. She had believed exile was the price of her freedom. Then She learned survival was the price of motherhood. Now, she understood the final, terrible cost. To keep him safe, she had to disappear not just from the world, but from the very edge of it. She had to go where no wolf would follow, where the air was too thin and the ground too cruel. She had to become a ghost in a place even ghosts avoided. Her hands settled on her belly, feeling the potent, quiet life within. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw against the howling wind. "The world is not ready for you, so we will go where the world ends." The price of being found was annihilation. And so, she would pay the price of being forever lost. The cold in Kael's chambers had nothing to do with the season. It was the cold of a tomb, of a heart frozen mid-beat. The strategic maps on his table, the treaties awaiting his seal, the reports from the mountain ridge, they were all parchment ghosts, whispering of a hollow kingdom. The only thing that felt real was the gnawing, screaming void in his chest, shaped like an heir. Lyra's glacial threat had hung in the air for days, a sword suspended by a hair. The council's disapproving silence was a heavier weight. He was alpha in name, a figurehead of crumbling authority. He ate, he spoke, he ruled, but he was a puppet whose strings were tangled around the throat of a ghost. It was the dream that broke him. Not a dream of Elara weeping, or of the child laughing. It was a dream of silence, of standing in the bramblewood, the old Helda staring at him with those flint eyes, and her voice wasn't a rasp, but the sound of stones grinding together. You will never hear its first cry. You will never know its face. Your line will end with you, knowing you cast it out into the dark. He awoke not with a start, but with a terrible, slow clarity, drenched in a cold sweat. The first weak light of dawn was spearing through his window, illuminating the dust motes dancing over his empty bed. Never hear its cry. Never know its face. The fear he had used to justify her rejection, the fear for her safety, paled into insignificance beside this new primal terror. The terror of absolute loss. Not of a mate, but of his future, his legacy, his child. The council's logic, Lyra's political web, the pack's need for a strong front. It was all smoke. It was the clever, cowardly philosophy of a man trying to save a kingdom while letting its prince perish. He was not that man, not anymore. He rose, dressing not in his ceremonial furs, but in dark, practical leathers. He strapped on his hunting knives. The action felt more authentic than any royal decree he'd issued in weeks. He summoned Garon and 2 others, wolves whose loyalty was to him before it was to the council Tauren, a grizzled tracker with a silent tongue, and Riven, young, sharp-eyed, and unburdened by politics. They stood before him in the grey pre-dawn, confusion on their faces. "You are to go east," Kael said, his voice low, stripped of all pretense. It was not the voice of an alpha giving an order. It was the voice of a man stating a fundamental truth. Beyond the bramblewood, beyond the marked borders, you are to search the unclaimed lands. Garen's brows drew together. "Alpha, the council has forbidden sanctioned patrols beyond the bramblewood. It risks conflict with the rogues, and the mountain ridge. I am not sanctioning a patrol," Kael interrupted, his grey eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "I am sending a hunt. My hunt." The final 2 words landed in the still room like stones. My hunt. This was personal. This was primal. "The exiled she-wolf?" Tauren grunted, understanding dawning. "No, Kael said, and the word was a gut punch, even to himself. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his gaze pinning each of them. You are not looking for a she-wolf. You are looking for a child. My child. She carries it. Garon's face went pale. The secret was out, now entrusted to them. The magnitude of it, the political explosion, the dynastic implication was written in his stunned eyes. Kael didn't flinch. You will find them. You will not engage. You will not be seen. You will track. You will locate. And you will report only to me. If the council learns of this, if Lyra catches a whisper, you answer to me alone. It was a command that could get them banished. It was a mission that could start a war. But the look in their alpha's eyes was not one of madness, but of a desperation so profound it had become its own kind of steel. This was not the broken man from the high table. This was a wolf who had caught the scent of his lost pup. Bring me word of my heir, Kael said, the final word, leaving his lips not as a title, but as a plea, a prayer, a bedrock need. Nothing else matters. The three wolves exchanged a look, then bowed, not the formal bow to their alpha, but the deeper bow of wolves, committing to a sacred, secret quest. As they slipped from the stronghold like ghosts, Kael turned back to the window. The sun was rising, painting the eastern sky in hues of fire and blood. He had broken the rules. He had disobeyed his own counsel. He had potentially jeopardized everything. But for the first time since the night in the grove, the restlessness within him stilled. The hunt was on, not to reclaim a mate, to find his child. And in that singular, ferocious purpose, the shattered alpha began, piece by painful piece, to reassemble himself into something new, a father. The world at the roof of the world was a blade of wind and stone. Elara had found a cave so high that clouds drifted through its mouth, a place of eternal winter and profound silence. It was here, she believed, they could finally disappear. The child's power still hummed, a low, warm frequency in her blood. But the thin air and sheer isolation seemed to dampen its reach into the world below. Then came the blood moon. It rose not as a silver disk, but as a swollen copper-red eye, staining the snowfields and glaciers with a light the colour of old rust and new wounds. The air itself grew heavy, charged with a wild, unpredictable energy. The child, so often a quiet, steady presence, began to stir as the moon cleared the peaks. Not the gentle rolls of sleep, but a deep, rhythmic restlessness, as if answering a primal call. The first pain was not the cramp of hunger or the ache of cold. It was a vice, sudden and brutal, clamping low in her spine and radiating through her abdomen. It stole her breath, buckling her knees. She caught herself against the cave wall, gasping. No, too soon. But her body did not listen to fear. The ancient, inexorable process had begun, triggered by the lunar tide or the child's own potent readiness. The pains came again, closer, sharper, tearing through her with a ferocity that left her whimpering on the cold stone floor. Her carefully gathered supplies, clean moss, boiled strips of hide, the healer's last vial of strengthening tincture seemed pitiful, human things against this storm of raw creation. As another wave of agony crashed over her, she couldn't contain it. A ragged cry was torn from her lips, echoing faintly in the cavern. And the world answered, not with an echo, with a shiver. The very air in the cave thickened, shimmering like a heat haze, charged with the ozone earth scent of the child's power, now unleashed and amplified by her pain. The red moonlight filtering into the cave didn't just illuminate, It seemed to coalesce around her trembling form, a nebulous crimson aureole. Down the mountain, in the frozen valleys and lonely forests, wolves stopped. A rogue, gnawing on a frozen carcass, lifted its head. A lone hunter, miles from any pack, froze mid-step. In the exile settlement Mara had left a moon ago, every wolf scarred, broken, and forgotten, suddenly turned as one toward the high peaks, their hearts hammering against their ribs. It was not a sound, it was a summons. A silent, sovereign command written in the language of blood and moon and absolute dominance. It spoke to the wolf in them, to the oldest, most obedient part of their souls. One by one, then in small groups, they moved, not with predatory intent, but with a solemn, instinctive gravity. They climbed beyond their normal ranges, drawn upward through the blizzard-scoured passes. They gathered on the rocky slopes below her cave, a silent, ragged congregation of the lost and the wild, and as one, as the wind carried a new piercing cry of effort and pain from above, they bowed. Muzzles touched the snow, haunches lowered. It was a homage to the raw, painful act of a king being born. Far to the west, in the Nightfang's stronghold, Alpha Kael was staring at a map, his finger tracing imagined paths through the unclaimed lands. He had heard nothing from Garon. The silence was a fresh torture. Without warning, it felt as though a white-hot brand was seared across the scar of his severed mate bond. He cried out, a choked sound of shock and agony, and dropped to his knees, his hands clutching his chest. It wasn't pain from Elara. It was a cataclysm of connection, a violent, brilliant reignition, not of romance, but of a deeper, more fundamental link. Blood, lineage, legacy. Through the blinding psychic surge, he felt it all. The tearing pain, the wild red-tinged power staining the air, the silent gathering reverence of unseen wolves. And beneath it, a new, tiny, unimaginably potent spark flaring into being in the world. His spark. In the bramblewood, the old healer stood at the edge of her thicket, her face tilted to the bloody moon. She felt the shift in the wind, the silent bowing of the wild things. She knew. The heir is being born, she whispered to the night, her words carried away on a wind that now seemed to blow from the future itself, a wind of change, of power, of reckoning. She turned her flinty eyes towards the distant, sleeping territories of the great packs. And the pack that claims him? A slow, knowing smile touched her cracked lips. Will rule the future. In the cave, with a final, soul-rending push that echoed with power, Elara brought new life, howling and radiant, into the crimson light. The child's first cry was not a weak wail. It was a clear, strong sound that resonated in the stone, and on the slopes below, the bowed wolves lifted their heads and answered it with a single, harmonious howl that shook the frozen peaks. The heir was here, and the world, from the highest mountain to the deepest Alpha's hall, had just shifted on its axis.